Godzilla versus The Blob.
We are finally back with a Pichy and Palscast, recorded at the usual time, the usual place, in person. We're all gazing lovingly into each other's eyes. How are you all feeling, everyone?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you.
Yeah, I'm good. Better than what we were halfway through, I suppose.
Better than last week?
No, we watched good stuff last week, didn't we?
We watched one great thing.
We watched one great thing.
And Tomorrowland.
Tomorrowland. We finished on The Incredibles, so I think we felt pretty good last time. So yeah.
I don't feel as bad as the bad of last week.
But not as good as the good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another humdrum, miserable week. Just running that rat race, spinning those wheels. I was in a pretty bad mood most of this week, so I decided to abandon the plan that I promised on Monday and go with something which I would find a much easier watch. I think you can understand why this would be an easier watch for me, so I'll go down the first two things that we viewed. First, we viewed an animated short by animator Marv Newland that was written by Marv Newland, directed by Marv Newland, had a screenplay by Marv Newland, was produced by Marv Newland.
Oh, and his wife.
Yes, as Matt is saying when I haven't activated his microphone.
Oh.
Yes, Marv Newland is produced by Mr. and Mrs. Newland. Yes, we watched Bambi Meets Godzilla, an animated short from 1969, which was a very big influence on me as a young person. I was someone who got into kaiju films quite early on into my life, and seeing that short pop up on a tape for Mothra vs. Godzilla, or as the tape I had of it was known in the American localization, Godzilla vs. The Thing. The Thing not being a rocky fellow with mutant powers, but rather Mothra, a giant moth, and its two offspring that hatch from an egg and defeat Godzilla by string-shotting it to death. Or at least just sealing poor Godzilla away for a while. And that short popped up at the end of the tape. The main, most famous joke of the short is that Godzilla squishes Bambi, but that's nowhere near as funny as the opening credits gag. As we have Kuraihen playing there, everyone's favourite Swiss song. I'm bringing up Kuraihen because Kuraihen is a Swiss folk song, which in the 18th century was quite popular amongst despondent soldiers and mercenaries who were leaving home and serving time over the Alps and pining for homes. They would sing this folk song, and it often got banned in military circles because of people just using it to whine about home instead of focusing on killing people. The various medical people who observed this phenomenon at the time coined a word to describe what was occurring, and that word is... Stunned silence there by both my friends. Nostalgia.
Oh, okay. It's the word I thought, but it was too simple. Word to go with, so I decided it had to be something more interesting.
Nope, that's just the origin story for nostalgia as a concept. And this is then followed by the second film that we saw today, Godzilla vs. The Blob, a 2000 black and white short film recorded to VHS via a Tyco Kids video cam, written, directed, and produced by one Hans Pichy Stockmann and his older sister. This film is a derivative piece of rubbish.
Also better than the first movie that we saw by far.
That being the first feature film that we saw.
Yes.
Yeah. Ultimately, I guess I'll give some production trivia to Godzilla vs. The Blob. First of all, there is a blob present, as there is in a lot of the Hans Pichy Stockmann body of work, and that is because it was a very cheap costume to produce. It required me and a blanket. There's actually a number of costuming flubs. You can see a child poking out of the blob blanket towards the later ends. You hear some strange wailing once the end card pops up, and that is because there was a production flub and the technician who was handling the title cards missed their cue and jumped in a bit too early, and so we didn't get to see the hilarious final moments of the blob deciding to spit out Godzilla as it was not happy with the taste.
I heard they got fired for that horrible thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes,
Matt hoping that they got fired. Well, unfortunately not. Although, as some additional trivia, to avoid risks of plagiarism, we replaced the Kuraihen from the original by Marv Newland with Morning Mood, which is, of course, the opening to Act 4 of Peer Gynt. And this is totally not just my sister forgetting the exact song used in Bambi Meets Godzilla. There was a planned sequel called Godzilla vs. the Even Bigger Blob. There was a teaser trailer filmed, but ultimately the production costs were far too high, and so was ultimately canned. The reason that the Blob defeats Godzilla, there's two issues. First, there were some perspective issues, which meant that the Blob was always going to look larger than Godzilla in any shot, no matter how he framed it. The other is that the Blob was a notoriously poor worker at the time, and refused to do a job for Godzilla.
Don't let the Blob into your company. They're a terrible worker. They never let anyone get over them. It's just don't let them do it.
Look, brother, if you put me over this one time, I'll do you the favor down the road, and we'll really get the heat, and we'll really get things going, and really get this program rolling.
I guess Hulk Hogan really was the Blob in TNA, so I guess it actually does kind of work out.
Ooh, that was pretty harsh there, mate. Hogan's had some shape issues, but not as bad as some.
I told him his shape. I just meant is like him taking over everything and kind of just destroying everything on his way in and out.
Homogenizing everything.
I wouldn't quite say that. Let's not talk about details of terrifyingly bad TNA booking. We'll save that for whenever we actually do a wrestling show. So that was obviously all a pre-show. There was even a Val Morgan mid-90s opening. That was pretty great. So the actual films that we watched today were 1958's The Blob and 1954's Godzilla. 1958, The Blob, of course, the debut of actor Steve McQueen, playing a character named Steve Andrews. Very creative naming there. It also featured the debut of The Teenagers as the opening credits roll. And really, the opening credits are the best part of the film. They're the best use of color, the most interesting art direction, and this infectiously catchy song, complete with a pop in the middle, which is going to sound awful as I didn't bring my pop filter. The Blob theme song has that, making this the most anime thing that we saw today.
Just like in general? Yeah, do you have anything you want to say, Louis, about The Blob?
I don't know. This is the second time I've seen it. I don't remember it dragging as much as it did. Although I suspect I may not have been sober now that I think about it.
So you couldn't have been too young then when you saw it the first time?
No, it was recent.
Wow.
Ish. A few years ago, I think.
Alright. This was the first time I'd ever seen it, and as has been the pattern in this podcast, it's those kind of like very popular, well-known films that everyone knows The Blob.
Why are you such a hipster, Matt? Sheesh.
This is actual shit. Like, this isn't like Ben-Hur where I can kind of see someone say something like I still think would be bullshit, but I can see the argument of like start of cinema. You could talk about like how great some of the scenes were, just in terms of like the production value and just like how big and sweeping some of them were, and the use of extras, the scale. Yeah, that's a good word. I can kind of see that. And Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, there's probably like a cultural difference between me and Americans there. Just in terms of why they like it. But this is actual shit. Like, this is a terrible, terrible film. And I hated it. It's not terrible like those movies where this is kind of like Mystery Science Theater kind of level of shit.
Yes, this is absolutely a Mystery Science Theater style bad film. This is something that, as people learn the concept of bad film, or even just in general conversation with people who go to the movies and like seeing movies but aren't quite students of film, is that there is an incredibly wide scale and varying types of bad film. And we're starting to see a bit of what that spread looks like over the course of this show. Since you have, I would say one of the worst films I've ever seen is the Cremaster, everything in the Cremaster cycle. And those are like this ultimate culmination of poor intent, poor production values, woefully stretched out, bad, meaningless visual metaphors.
What is the Cremaster cycle?
Ask me later. It's a super pretentious artistic project by a guy who basically... Well, they're named after the Cremaster muscle, which is a muscle in the prostate that dictates how a bunch of the testicles function. So there's a big bunch of imagery related to testicles, but really it's just meaningless nonsense, but it has an intentionally forced scarcity in its production, along with all sorts of super pretentious supplementary material you can acquire. So the point is that every now and then this will pop up in art house theatres at jacked up prices, and you've heard that it's a thing, it's an art thing, and if you're a student of the game, then you want to see this art thing. So then you go, oh, well that's a piece of bullshit. But then the artist says, oh, no, you haven't read the actual book, of which there's only like 50 copies ever printed, and they cost $2,000 each. So it's bad art, it's bad craftsmanship, and it's got poor intent.
Scam, essentially.
Yeah, it's done in poor faith.
So that's like, I would say, probably the worst of every facet of bad film. Then you have something like The Book of Henry, which was well produced, but just poor in intent. And then The Blob is something where it's kind of poor in intent, it's just a cynical, lazy horror movie. And it's also just really poor, sloppy production. There's inconsistent costuming. It's not quite at the level of, say, boom mics falling into frame or camera shadows on characters, but the sets are cheap. The day for night shots are really obvious. The acting is bad, and the script is just so poorly functioning. Scene after scene after scene of people saying words that have no bearing on the plot or their characters.
I think lazy is definitely a really good way to describe this film. And I think of all those elements that you talked about being bad, I think the script probably is like the primary culprit, where there are just scenes that are so meandering. They have no effect on the plot whatsoever. They don't reveal anything. They don't push the story forward. They're just there. It's like a student like at high school or university that just has to they have like a word count they have to get to, and they just start writing any kind of bullshit. They just try and stretch and drag out every little bit of their essay to get to that word count. It reminds me of it feels like they for some reason had a running time they wanted, and so the person is just writing dialogue that has no... there's one scene where we learn one of the police officers in the film plays chess in his spare time, and as the main characters as they were, left that police station to go do plot stuff, we decided to stay with him so he could play chess over the radio for about 30 seconds to a minute, I guess, and it had no bearing on the plot whatsoever. None. And that's I think an example of just the movie as a whole. It's just, yeah, this was really poor.
And it's not just that it spends so much time on these scenes that go nowhere. Things that are actually plot relevant occur off screen in throwaway lines during these meandering scenes that go nowhere. Even cheap emotional hooks like "Will the dog be saved from the blob?" is resolved off screen by a guy saying, "Yeah, we saw a dog running around outside nearby recently." That, I guess I should, as an apology for last week, I didn't quite go into the base plot outlines for either of the films, and that's something I should make sure that we do from this point onward, just assuming that people haven't watched things before. So, the plot of The Blob is a meteorite falls to Earth, and out comes a little blob creature hatched from an egg. It latches onto a man's hand. Steve McQueen and his girlfriend find that man as he runs onto the road. They take him to a doctor. In the doctor's office, the blob fully forms and eats the man. It then eats the doctor's nurse, then also eats the doctor. Steve McQueen then spends way too long talking to police officers who refuse to believe him. They go investigate the doctor's surgery and can't find anyone there, so they assume it's a prank. Steve McQueen goes home. Steve McQueen leaves home. Steve McQueen's girlfriend goes home. Steve McQueen's girlfriend leaves home. And they then meander around. They try to get their friends, their alleged friends. They get the teenagers. The teenagers split up to help look for the blob. Steve McQueen and his girlfriend wind up in a supermarket. Steve McQueen and his girlfriend leave a supermarket. Then the blob attacks a diner just as they happen to walk into it. The blob covers the entirety of the diner. Then they decide they need to freeze it because it doesn't like the cold, because it didn't chase them when they were in a fridge in the supermarket. So they freeze it by using CO2 gas fire extinguishers. Not liquefied CO2. Gas CO2 fire extinguishers. And then it's shipped off to the Arctic. As the title crawl says, the end. And then the end morphs into a question mark. So you've probably heard me over the years say, the end, question mark. There is an animated series produced by Nickelodeon in about 1996 called Angry Beavers. There's a running gag in that show that the main characters are fans of this era of bad horror films. And there is an episode where they decide to tape their own. And it culminates in them, say, in a title card that says the end with a question mark. And they read it off in the final cut. It's just, whenever I use that cadence, it's an Angry Beavers reference.
I haven't seen Angry Beavers in years.
I've never seen Angry Beavers.
That's great.
Okay.
It's better than everything we watched tonight.
Yeah, it's... What am I trying to say? Like, there's so much here that is just so horribly done that I guess might as well start at the start where, or at least near the start, where I feel like when I was first realizing just how insane this movie was going to be, was around the part where they had found the guy with the blob on his hand, and they take him to the doctor's, and the doctor had told them. And I found this weird. I didn't know if that was like because it was part of like the setting or whether it was just gonna be a really bad movie thing. Was the doctor's like, could you go and check out where you found him to try and learn more? And I was like, that's it. Like, would a doctor really ask a main character to say that? Either way, he does. But then he goes outside to his car with his girlfriend. This is Steve McQueen, that is. And he meets the teenagers for the first time. And they have like. Even though, like, it's really important that he goes and tries to find out what's going on with the old guy, he has a quest, really. They decide to have a race. And...
This isn't framed in the text as some say he's trying to be a responsible person, but there's these hoodlums that are his friends who are leading him astray and distracting him from the topic at hand. It just removes any tension at all and just flat out goes, hey, let's have this meandering conversation with these young hoodlums, where he then tricks them by driving the car backwards quick, and then he brakes sooner than they do, so they're at the other end of the intersection when there's no one else around at night. Before we get back to this, another side note, all the car scenes are really freaking bad car scenes. We're talking still shots of cars interspersed with pre-recorded stock footage of cars driving to indicate sections of movement, and usually just like hard cuts to somewhere else in the scenery while you hear the sound of a car stopping play. Like, there is as little movement as possible because they may not have actually had cars in a number of these shots.
Yeah, it was something that I wrote down pretty early on, and it kind of got superseded by just how horrible the movie is in other areas. But like, one of the first things I wrote was just like a very flat, and the movie was just very flat and stale, and that was usually in the cinematography, in the direction, in the dialogue. The whole movie just has this kind of flatness to it. Like, there's no right tension or really forward momentum. And I definitely saw that in those opening scenes with the cars, especially. I guess it kind of, as I say, kind of got superseded by just how crazy the movie got, and just like the really bad scripting decisions, kind of just like it's like. But yeah, and after he has a little race, non-race, however you want to put it, after he tricks the teens, he has a conversation with a police officer who sees this. He sees some of it anyway, and he's like. And he goes over to him because obviously he's like, why are you on the wrong side of the road? Why are you driving backwards? You seem like you're a teen that's like a teen hoon kind of driver. And I mean, I can barely remember what the words exchanged between him and the police officer were, because it really felt like they were both having a stroke during their conversation. It was... I think Lou was actually doing a great job of like doing the movements of it. Yeah.
Like Steve McQueen trying to look uncomfortable and awkward and like pretending to steer the wheel. And I don't know, what do you think I was doing, officer? I don't know, what was I doing?
They're almost completely incomprehensible. I think it's supposed to be witty banter. I think that's what it's supposed to be. I'm not entirely sure what they could be going for, because it's a solid 5-6 minutes of just incomprehensible dialogue where I think I honestly can't tell. I know it's supposed to be witty and it's supposed to be like a banter between them. I can't tell whether he's supposed to be a cool teen in that moment, whether he's supposed to be awkward. I don't know. All I know is that they both need medical attention during that scene.
Every time Steve McQueen tries to play like the I think he's trying to be like a preppy good guy, like kind of nervous kid. He looks uncomfortable. Like he looks really uncomfortable.
He also looks about 45.
Yeah, he was 27 when he made this movie.
If you told... I remember about Steve McQueen, so if you told me that he was in his 40s in this movie, I would have believed you. Like, it was... It's that noticeable. Yeah.
Yeah, that scene really, really encapsulates what I would say are the three pillars of the Blob's failures as a work of film, which are the script, the cinematography, and the editing, which I guess is basically the three pillars of filmmaking.
It fails as a film.
But these three particular facets are the ones that really, really stand out. Because the scripting, just the dialogue in that scene is stilted and awkward, utterly directionless in what its tone is meant to be, and what it's trying to accomplish in the narrative. The cinematography is one mid-range shot. Single one, just there. Constantly. Yeah, it's all very, very square framing. It's utterly boring to look at. And there's no editing cuts. There's no switches of perspective. There's no movement. There's the way that every scene is cut from scene to scene. The structural editing is atrocious in this film. Occasionally there's scenes which almost feel like they're out of order, but mostly they're just cut in the most boring way. The rhythm of this film is long and dull. And I'm someone who prides themselves on being able to stay awake and pay attention with film. Like, a lot of people enjoy things like putting on film and television in the background while they're working. I can't do that. I have to focus on a text because I want to look at it and see what insight I can gain from it. But this is one of those films where, because these three things are so weak, my brain's not being engaged with the narrative, and it's so visually dull, and the rhythm is so stretched out. Like, I start nodding off in this film every single time, because it's almost impossible to focus. There's nothing that your brain is interested in paying attention to until you get some fun miniature shots towards the end.
Yeah, I felt like I wasn't falling asleep, but I was like, my body just kept on trying to tell me to do something. Like, it wanted me to get up and, like, get something to eat or just move around, just do something with my body, because there was just nothing happening in so many scenes. Like, it really can't be overstated just how many scenes were just had 0 points to them. And you wonder how they even came about in the first place. Like, I don't understand how that chess scene happens. Like the only thing that goes through my brain is, like, maybe when it was written, there was going to be more to it in some way. Like maybe that the character, the police officer in question, somehow him playing chess was going to be important to the story in some way. It sounds insane, but like I can't think of, like, there's so many things like that which feel that they have no place in the story whatsoever, that I wonder how they could be there in the first place.
It's also the sort of scene where it's entirely possible that there was some in-joke on set that was funny. This will quite often happen in film, where there's ad-lib lines or weird little moments that will appear during the shoot, because shooting for a film can be a very long and tiresome process. You can spend like 18 hours on set each day, and you're getting tired and frustrated and slightly delirious. And so someone will say or do something, and everyone on set will just think it's the funniest thing ever. And they go, hey, let's keep it in, that'll be great. And usually it's not great.
Yeah. I feel like another thing that I really want to complain about is probably the scenes after that Steve McQueen sees a doctor is killed by the Blob, which is around the middle of the movie, I guess. There's a long time where the Blob is not seen very much. You were talking about, Adam was talking about so much is done off screen at that point, where we just kind of hear about people disappearing around the town. And there's a lot of scenes, or a lot of time is spent with Steve McQueen talking to police officers. And it is just... It's not just him talking to police officers, there's also be scenes of just the officers talking to themselves, so sometimes the parents will get involved. And it's...
Don't forget the iconic scene where the caretaker of the doctor's house spontaneously appears to deny any presence. It's the sort of scene that would make sense if it were a government or alien conspiracy movie, where like this is an agent who's been put to get all the protectors of peace and justice off the case for a while. But it has no role in a faceless entity that only consumes. That sort of villain does not need that sort of plot element. Yeah. It's utterly baffling in its presence, and it almost feels like someone has just seen other movies, possibly ones with alien or government conspiracies in them, and goes, well, that's a scene that you have in movies, so we'll put it in ours.
I feel like there's like two explanations for that scene. Like what Adam's talking about, like, there's a bit where they go back to the doctor's office or whatever, like his building, and he's obviously, the doctor isn't there because the Blob has eaten him entirely, consumed him, as well as the nurse. And he's like saying, look, we gotta find him, like Steve McQueen. Like they don't believe Steve McQueen because they seem to think of him as like a teenager that can't be trusted. Like he's playing a gag on them. That's kind of like a running thing with the police. And then that old lady, she's like, she really does just show up out of nowhere, doesn't she? Like I was really, like, I didn't know what was going on at first.
Yeah,
like something like a flash of red. Yeah.
And just exclaims, the doctor's not going to be happy with this.
Yeah. It's super weird. Like, I feel like there's two explanations. It's either what Adam said, where it's just like, they put it in because they saw other movies, or it was just yet another stalling tactic. And there's a lot of those. They were trying to do almost like the Spielberg Jaws type of thing, where they just could not have it on the screen. And I feel like with this kind of movie, it's so lazy. Even scenes where the Blob isn't on the screen, but like there's like it's an action scene, like maybe it's off screen, but they're running away from it or something like that. Like I feel like they didn't want to do many of those scenes at all. They just wanted to have scenes where they could just sit down or stand up and talk. Like that's what they were comfortable with, that's what they were happy with, and they wanted as many scenes of that as possible. So I feel like you go either way with that one. And then, like you saw as well, not just with the old lady, but with the there's like a secondary antagonist with the police chief second in command.
Jim.
Yes, Jim, who randomly says right near the end of the film, he talks about the fact that he was in the war, and he suspects the teenagers of hating him because
he was in the war.
He was in the war. Like they're on the way, and he's like, he plays the skeptic in the film, where he doesn't believe the teens, doesn't believe anyone he says is a monster. He thinks it's a gag. These no good rapscallion teens are just causing trouble.
Teens.
Yeah, and I feel like it's just a padding. It's like without those two people and every other kind of stalling tactic they have, this movie would be like half an hour. So yeah.
Another problem that is demonstrated in the random woman scene is it brings up the subplot of... Well, it brings up a plot thread, rather, that, hey, there's this false flag of the doctor is in the next town over, and so you gotta wait a bunch of time to get a confirmation on if he's arrived at his hotel. And this, of course, sets up a ticking clock scenario, which means there's like some degree of time flow in which, things can get worse until the moment of truth is discovered here. Then the cops will discover there's something right and something amiss and take action. But the film doesn't understand that this is a thing you can do. And so it just abandons this plot thread entirely 2 scenes later. So, I'm just bringing this up as, this is a thing to think about when you're scripting stories. As a tool that you can use to get impetus to your scenes. I guess I'll move into broad thematic strokes here and we'll start to move towards Godzilla, unless Matt has more that he wants to say about The Blob.
I suppose I would just say that The Blob, I mean, you say it looks great. I feel like it's one of the most unthreatening monsters I've ever had the misfortune to watch, and
there was a tinge of irony in me saying it looks great.
You're not a friend of strawberry jam?
I have a certain fondness for, just cheesy red dye with a bunch of, basically pectin.
This is probably one of the least important ones, but I do find that it's so unthreatening and the people have to act, the people in the movie have to act so dumb to fall prey to this thing. And it is so dumb that usually you can't really even see it. Most people that it kills, you don't really see it kill them. I feel like there's the guy in the movie theater who it sneaks up on fairly effectively, which is fine. But, especially the nurse, at the start where she falls over, knocks over a light, and somehow that turns off the lights in the entire building.
Yeah, that's the most egregious one. So, here's the thing, is that when we're saying that it looks bad because you don't see people attacked by the blob, you can very effectively cut tense, exciting action sequences where you don't see the actual points of contact. That's good montage theory in your editing, where you're just interspersing the right images in sequence, that even though you're not seeing anything, your brain has already filled in the blanks. This film, for the most part, doesn't do it, and when you do get concentrated action, it's things like, as Matt just mentioned, the nurse trips over and inexplicably trips over in her own surgery, and knocking over a light shorts the house's circuit board. This is not how electricity works, but it's required in order for there to be any sort of potential for the blob to have an advantage at that point.
Yeah.
Because it's tiny and ineffectual, which has its own charm. And I like the scenes where people are screaming from the blob because it's so flagrantly slow and pathetic and not actually capable of doing anything. That's to me, that's good campy charm. But the scenes and the time it takes to get to those moments is so drawn out that you're just begging for anything more than that to happen at the time.
It's a movie that it's so poor that I think we've really struggled to talk about this movie. I feel like this might be one of the hardest movies we've had to try and come up with something interesting to say. Of all the movies we've watched in the podcast, just because it's like a regular kind of bad, as in it's not something you can talk about Book of Henry for days. You can talk about Tomorrowland because it is so aggravating, that kind of the theme that it has.
Yeah, Tomorrowland is another note. I wasn't particularly happy with our discussion on it last week because I felt it was a bit too messy, but I think the way that I need to rectify this is I think I actually do need to make a video essay on that film and really pick apart piece by piece everything that's broken with it.
But this is just bad. This is just a bad script and bad acting. It's just bad, there's not much more you can really say about it. It's clearly been lazily made by people who probably didn't care that much, and because they didn't care very much whether it was good or bad, it's just
why should we care?
Yeah.
Well, we managed to get half an hour of discussion out of it, so I would say that was a pretty good go.
Well done, us.
So I think I'll start moving into the second film we watched, which was the original Godzilla, the plot of which is that there's a big lizard, and a scientist theorizes that it has been woken up by nuclear testing, breaking it free of where it's been sealed up ever since the end of the Jurassic period. It's out, it's tough, it doesn't really care about radiation, it smashes up Tokyo a bunch. Some people discover that there is another scientist who's been working on a project called the Oxygen Destroyer, which destroys the oxygen. We don't want to get into the actual, the science behind destroying the oxygen of water, yet still having all that water. What matters is, it is a thing that will near instantly kill anything it comes into contact with, and strips the flesh off bones, then also destroys the bones. It's a weapon of mass destruction, and its role as being part of the nuclear weaponry metaphors that the film is rife with is really what it's there to be. These are both films that I saw a number of times in my childhood. The first time I saw Godzilla, since I'd been so enamored with the imagery and the pomp, and being told, Godzilla's these great camp movies, and indeed the first time I saw Godzilla the film, this is a fairly morose film, and it's at its best when it's being at its most bleakest and sad and stressed out, because it's just depicting just the general wide shock and panic that people get inflicted upon them during a national disaster. And so my dad making jokes about, hey, look at that fake helicopter there, kind of annoyed me even as an 8-year-old. Since I was an 8-year-old and I hadn't seen all the films ever, the death of Godzilla made me quite sad, and I cried when it died. I didn't care about Dr. Serizawa and his noble sacrifice to make sure that mankind would never have access to this horrible weapon again. I was just sad that the big lizard was dead. Because I was a kid. Nostalgia, everyone.
So you sided with Professor Yamane.
Let's not get into the ideology here. I was a kid. That said, we should go back to The Blob and mention that it has the greatest child actor in the history of film.
Yeah, I was going to say there are a number of, if there is one thing I want to bring up about The Blob, it's a number of very amusing lines and moments within that film. Just quickly back about people running away from it. One of the funniest is when Jane and Steve are in the supermarket and she just throws herself at a pile of cans. She picks up the dog, sees the blob, and then jumps into a pile of cans.
And then requires help to get up. Women characters are not treated well in either of these films. Yeah.
Yes, the damsel in distress is very alive and well. And it's very much a cliche of the era to have the woman who, while fleeing, inexplicably trips over thin air and then twists her ankle, thus requiring the big strong man nearby to carry her away.
But yeah, that child actor in The Blob, I know you wanted to talk about them, so yeah. Well, it's Jane's brother, right? Basically, she's sneaking out to go find the Blob with Steve. And I remember this. Once again, I'm passing the ball to Lloyd just because you did his voice so well. Sorry, man.
Yeah, put me on the spot for this, but what is the dialogue? It's like,
are you afraid to go out at night?
I'm not afraid. I'll guard you. What's the name? What's the dog's name? I'll name it William. I don't like William. It's the stiffest line. He's just reading a piece of cardboard that they're holding next to Jane out the back.
And that piece of cardboard may not even have those actual lines in, because almost all the dialogue in this film is really poorly ADR'd in post.
Yeah, that's probably a good thing to remember for The Blob, because that was genuine comedy. So I enjoyed in an otherwise very drab, boring film. So it's good to bring it up.
So yeah, Godzilla.
So back to the bleak misery of the original Godzilla. Basically, this film is at its strongest when it's painting in really broad strokes. When it's just, here is this disaster that's hitting a nation that's recovering from war and struggling with its own sense of identity. And just, here's this thing that's reminding them of all their failures, all the horrors that have been inflicted on them, all the horrors they have inflicted. And there's just scenes of mass panic, the processes that you need to go through as a country to manage this sort of crisis, just scenes of people jumping out to try and help rescue people who have been destroyed in boats. People confused about what's happened, why these boats are disappearing, and just bombarding bureaucracy with just, we want answers, what's happening. Steadily moving into these shots of just these sounds of Godzilla approaching, these scenes where it first peeks over the mountaintop on a small volcanic island where it's been spotted, there's those, and even those moments of wanton destruction. Yes, there's some cheesy scenes with miniatures, and Godzilla is a rubber suit, and it's just a dry ice effect to make the atomic breath in this film, with some cheap recoloring of the frames to make it look glowy. The spines on Godzilla's back look glowy, but they are still very effective. The soundscape, when it's really, really used, is fantastic. Just this booming, morose score. The Godzilla roar, even in the first film, is a spectacular piece of audio recording. It's big, it's intimidating, and is to a certain degree horrifying. What I was going to try and get at with looking at these two films together wasn't just, hey look, there's two big monster movies. Like, the sorts of stories about monsters you create, you can use the monster to say all sorts of things about yourself, and have monsters represent all sorts of ideas. And one of the ideas I wanted to get at was, like, what are both of these monsters? And the Blob is very much the product of a victorious, complacent, safe, strong nation. Whereas just, what is there to be scared of? The answer is, I guess, some sort of external threat. But even then, the external threat isn't really anything that important. It's just, sometimes you'll get this little thing and it'll mess up a little bit of a town, and that'll be a bit of a nuisance. Whatever, we're strong, we can deal with it. Whereas Godzilla is quite well known for its nuclear warfare metaphors. And even without that, like, there's just this real sense of trauma in a lot of the broad scenes, the bigger scenes of this film, that really comes through in the text. The biggest weakness with Godzilla, the original film, is when it tries to narrow its focus and be more about individual characters, since it spends so much of the time just painting its world, essentially. When it tries to actually talk about characters, it's already used up, like, half of its runtime. And so they're all very, very flat one-note characters who espouse a couple of ideas, and then the movie ends.
Yeah, that's I think a perfect way to encapsulate the movie, in that I really enjoyed the broad strokes, and particularly the stuff with Godzilla. I think it was especially because it's such an old film, and I found that my experience, especially with this podcast, watching old films, is that there's a kind of a bit of a flatness, a bit of a staleness, a stillness to everything, like with the cinematography and the kind of sounds that are used. And I felt that this movie had those same problems, but when it was in full flow with Godzilla, it was like, wow, this is actually a little bit more how I'd expect a modern film to go. Just like the combination of the special effects of Godzilla, seeing these big cities get destroyed, the sounds of Godzilla, the music that's thumping. Like, when the movie's in full flow like that, it's fantastic, and I really enjoyed that. I think the lack of a main character for like at least half an hour, maybe more, I think that was my major concern with the movie, and why just a lack of like a person to like hang on to, like a main character. I feel like the lack of a main character is like kind of a big flaw, in any kind of film.
See, that's not necessarily something I agree with the concept of film as a whole. I think that ensemble casts and looking at things like societies as a holistic unit, and I guess applying the protagonist idea to a group, is something that can work. And I think this film really could have achieved it if it really, really shot for it. And it's just that you get, when it tries to narrow that focus, not only does it not really have a lead who you can be emotionally attached to, it can't decide whether it wants to be talking about Dr. Yamane, a zoologist who's really interested in preserving and studying this and the implications of, like, do we have any more right to live than it does? Versus Dr. Serizawa, who's this guy who's developed some technology which he's desperately trying to find practical positive uses for, but all he can do with it is create more death. And how his conflict is about, like, should I deploy this weapon? And what are the political implications and the social implications once I do deploy it? Like, will this only just propagate further death and destruction? And so it ultimately decides to focus on him, with the final beats being about how he decides to destroy all his research and kill himself in the process of, okay, so I've helped solve this one problem, but, like, we do not need this weapon beyond this point ever again. Don't do any more nuclear testing. You made your point at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, guys.
Yeah. Okay, I wasn't meaning that, I guess when I said without a main character, I guess I was really just meaning there was no characters, really, at that point. Like, there was actually no one. Like, you could have, like, a very strong ensemble without a clear-cut main protagonist. I guess with Godzilla, though, there is... Like, there's no characters for the first half, which is a bit of a problem, yeah.
And part of the problem I'm getting at is that even when there are characters, they aren't really people.
Yeah. Like, you made them sound more interesting than they are, actually. Like, as, like, a concept, they're really good. Like, that, like, the Yamane character, the Serizawa character. You know, these... Like, those are really good dilemmas and concepts to have, like, a story around. But as you say, they are very one note. They don't really get them across very well. They don't have any elegance to them, really. I wonder whether if you had tried to focus on one of them at the start, so like maybe making it Dr. Sarazara's movie, like from the start, like he's the first person we meet, basically, and then we see him create this new technology at the start of the film, and we see his dilemma as Godzilla destroys the entire country, basically. Whether that would work, or like instead with Yamane, or with just a character to like follow from start to finish, whether that would have been better or not.
And then actually tie those characters together as actually being in some form of dialectic relationship. Yeah. That there is a conflict going on here, rather than just a bunch of ideas tossed into this primordial soup of emotions that the film is trying to convey at the same time.
Yeah, character salad. Yeah.
Tossed into a Godzilla salad.
Yeah, because I felt like one of the big... It was almost like... Remember we were talking about in Spider-Man 3 how it would raise a plot thread and then forget about it for a while? With Godzilla, it's actually fine enough. It kind of does the same thing where, like... It will have, like, Sarazara, like, it has the scene where we're essentially introduced to him. We see him a little bit beforehand.
Yeah, he's introduced in one of the first scenes, very casually, but then the scene where he actually appears is about 40-ish minutes into the film.
Yeah, so we see, like, we see a glimpse of him, then it's a big gap, then we finally meet him, where the female character that's there basically to cry and fall over, goes to talk to him for a while, and we... I think she's used to be his fiancée. And he's like, oh, I'm doing this science stuff. I've got this discovery to show you. And we don't really see all of it, but we get we certainly tell that there's something going on in his lab. And then we don't see him again for another long break. And that's kind of how it all kind of works. Like, Yamane, the older gentleman, the older scientist, a professor rather, he's kind of the same, where he'll just kind of like... He'll espouse a belief, and in this case, the belief is that
Godzilla, yeah.
Don't kill Godzilla. And then he just kind of shuffles off the screen, and we don't see him for a while. Then he comes back on the screen, he says, I don't think we should kill Godzilla. Shuffles off for a while, then a long break, then comes back.
Do you have any advice on how to defeat Godzilla? We shouldn't defeat Godzilla.
It's like there's no real character development, especially with Yamane. And... I think that's a bit of a problem. Like, we don't see that as Adam was saying. Like, we don't see that the conflict of ideas in the movie as it goes on, as we see the destruction. Like, I feel like surely there would have been a better way to structure this film, where you kind of have debate. So Godzilla obviously arrives, and then he does some destruction. Then we have a debate on how to destroy him. Should we destroy him? In what way? More destruction, and then we see how their arguments change as it gets more and more desperate. And I don't think they really managed that structure as well as they could, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's kind of forgivable for the time. And this is why creators have come back. Part of the reason why. The other reason is, of course, after a couple of sequels, Godzilla turns babyface. And there's then just, do you like seeing guys in rubber suits punching each other? Yeah, you do. It's really fun. And the Godzilla franchise then develops its own fandom in that direction. So there's so many themes and ideas across the franchise that it can inspire so many different creators to want to get their hands on this and get their own spin. I don't want to talk about Shin Godzilla in this episode, because I want to actually watch that with you again sometime and then talk about that with stuff, because I've seen it about 3 times now, and I've developed a greater appreciation for what it's doing. But there was something I was going to bring up here, which is an odd detail, which is, while we were watching this, Louis kept making jokes about how Dr. Serizawa kept looking so evil because he's got an eye patch, and this is an interesting facet of the semiotics and shorthand that film uses, because films are a visual medium, and so they'll try to convey, often if they're well crafted, will try to convey as much information to you subtly and visually as they can, and this results in a lot of shorthand and stereotyping, just because that's the easiest way to get across ideas. And so, quite often, eye patches are associated with pirates and bad guys, because, it's meant because the eyes are the gateway to the soul, and you want to have both eyes nice and big so you can see what someone's thinking. But when someone's lost an eye, it partially indicates damage, it indicates fighting, most likely is the implication, especially if there's scars, and just, you've lost half of the gateway to your soul. You're less of a person, you're less human, more animal, you're far less comprehensible. And so this all leads to the fact that sometimes people just have one eye, they've lost an eye. Especially this soon after a war has just happened. People are gonna only have one eye, and so it's kinda nice that the film is conveying that people have an eye, but we're so used to this imagery and these signifiers that when you see someone with an eye patch, you go, oh, well, I guess they're evil. And this is why quite often there will be characters in anime over the years that will pop up with only one eye. And they'll quite often have a white medical eye patch. Because that way, they're using imagery of white equals purity, as well as the medical components to say this is the product of damage, rather than any sort of corruption of their soul.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's more of injury than because when he first shows up on the pier, he looked to me like your government agent. He looks like he's gonna do something nefarious at some point, and he looks nefarious throughout the whole movie, but he's not, and he in fact saves the day, and he really probably should be the protagonist.
Yeah, it doesn't help that he the movie does shroud him in mystery. The first time we really get to know him, the last we see of him is he is doing something in his lab that causes the woman to scream in fear, and then she promises never to say what's going on in there. So there is some an audience could be a little suspicious of him, at least at the start.
Yeah, that it starts to have that shroud of mystery, but like a lot of the character moments as we've just discussed, it's got issues. It's wonky and nowhere close to perfect. And that happens as you're starting to work out the craft of film. These sorts of steps happen. And you can certainly see how this film would have so much influence. I'm gonna drop some references to a thing while I'm here, because Dr. Serizawa is the inventor of an important significant device, which is a ball inside a tube, and he wears sunglasses in his opening scene. This is all, of course, weirdly paid tribute to in Yasuhiro Imagawa's Giant Robo the Animation from 91 through to 99, all 7 episodes of wonderful pomp and camp. And yeah, there's this, although it's mostly about paying tribute to the works of Mitsuru Yokoyama, it does have this weird thread of Godzilla references throughout, where Dr. Shizuma has the sunglasses on the whole time as a nod to that first scene with Serizawa. The invention he develops looks like an oxygen destroyer, and one of the major plot threads turns out to be there was a bug in his power devices that turned them into oxygen destroyers. And it's the sort of thing which, when you're just watching that, if you aren't aware with the immense intertextuality of that work, it's hey, this is a kind of neat idea. And then if you're a grouchy old weirdo like me, it's just, man, that's some pretty deep cuts there, mate.
Remember how, if I remember correctly from what I saw, it actually has some stuff that can be kind of reminiscent of Godzilla. Just isn't there scenes of the city is kind of under threat by that big bowl thing that kind of reminds me a little bit of people in the way people reacted to it and they're waiting, like, what's this thing going to do? Is it going to attack the city? And, like, the way they were trying to decide what should we do to stop this giant bowl from destroying us.
Yeah, there's some echoes of it with the Foglosphere. There's also the element of the fear and horror of nuclear power brought about with Giant Robo itself.
Yeah.
One of the big art questions throughout Giant Robo is, can happiness be achieved without sacrifice? And of course, Godzilla is a text, which is part of the argument that no, it cannot.
I feel like one of the problems I had with the movie is that there's like... It was funny because it reminded me a little bit of Shin Godzilla, the Yano movie, just because it has, like, especially in the first half of it, has, like, a slight...
Yeah, the Hideaki, like, Shin Godzilla is absolutely trying to be the full realization of that concept. Like, that is a film which, Godzilla begins with these broad strokes. And so Shin Godzilla's like, let's focus entirely about, like, this is a film about how governments have to resolve natural disasters. And ultimately takes that to its final conclusion of, like, the way that you achieve this in the 21st century will require things like international cooperation, somewhat relinquishing your own sovereign powers, and having an effective public service is really, really useful for achieving things.
I think, though, that there's, like, a slight... like, cold attachment to it. Obviously there's a lot of, like, sadness when Godzilla's really destroying everything, and the scenes afterwards, when it's showing the destruction, there's obviously some emotion. But I feel like, especially when Godzilla shows up at first, I really wasn't a big fan of the many scenes that are either on a newsreel, or the ones that I really disliked were the ones where they would jump straight from Godzilla, performing acts of destruction to... I believe it was probably Parliament of some sort, like the government talking about it. Because they just, like... And they would have... I think they would have it probably be Professor Yaname, who was... And he would just kind of go on long, tedious tangents on, this is what Godzilla does, this is what he is, this is what we're thinking. And I felt like I was watching, like, a newsreel or, like, a report instead of a movie. And I felt like, especially because you'd have these scenes of such, like, tension and dread and such life, like when Godzilla was around, and then you just sort of just go,
See, I'm a nerd, and so I like to a certain degree those scenes because I like seeing the process and the, like, that dry academic discovery and trying to comprehend what's happening, as a contrast to the raw moments of the destruction. And I think there is an interesting dichotomy going on there, but I'm totally fine with you not liking those, like, and wanting to be more of that guttural, visceral bleakness. Like, I'm totally fine with you wanting more of that.
I feel like, well, I personally, this is just subjective because, like, people like different things. In my perfect ideal scenario, how it would go is you would have stuff like that.
Inconsistent.
Ah, damn. That cuts that theory out.
Please resume that thought.
Yeah, I feel like you could then have the main character, instead of cold cutting straight to those Parliament scenes, you could have characters, like, milling about, like you see the aftermath of the effects, and then you see the character slowly going into the room, into the Parliament room, and you kind of transition from that kind of action, that kind of gutter, that with the movie feeling so alive. And then you can kind of get that kind of, the main character has lived this. They've been through this horror. And so you can have them be kind of a little bit upset at how cold and calculating the government is. And you can still, as an audience, we can still get that, like, we can still have some fun watching the government work things out. We can see them making policy decisions, but we kind of just slowly transition there, and then we can slowly transition back to Godzilla instead of, like, these really fast cuts where the movie is, like, alive and then down. Like, you kind of go up and down on a nice little flow instead of like up and down, like with no slope at all. Yeah.
Yes, operating on slopes rather than hard drops and climbs.
Yeah.
I think that'll just about cover everything that we wanted to do tonight. Final thoughts.
The Blob is shit. Godzilla is not. Godzilla is...
Hooray! I'm taking that. I'm cutting you off right now, Matt. I got what I wanted out of you. I'm doing that. That's done. We're done. Signed, sealed, delivered. I'm yours. As for what's coming up for the next couple of weeks, Matt will be away next week, so there will likely not be one of these Palcasts. I am seeing an animes at the cinema on Monday, so I might do a reaction video / vlog / audio log. I'll probably bring a microphone and go, hey people, let's talk about the movie a bit. Or I might just record that in my car by myself and ramble about it. Either way, I intentionally chose these so I can leave on a cliffhanger and do a part 2 when we resume, which will be The Blob 1985 and Godzilla 1984. And we'll see how things change in the 30 years since the originals, when they first both had remakes. So until then, any other comments anyone would like to make tonight?
No, not really. Don't watch The Blob.
I guess I'd like to say I'm excited about seeing... I have seen the 1984 one. Is it 84, 85 for the...
85 for The Blob.
85 for The Blob, and I enjoyed it, but I felt like it was a guilty pleasure that I enjoyed it. But now that I've watched the original, I'm more satisfied with the fact that I liked that. And I have a feeling that I'd imagine what I liked in the original Godzilla with 30 years of refining. I think there's a good chance I might enjoy this remake of Godzilla as well. So I'm excited to watch those two films.
And with that, we'll talk to you again after a while.